King Charles I, who ruled England from 1625 until his execution in 1649, remains one of the most controversial and consequential figures in British history. His reign, marked by his belief in absolute monarchy and the divine right of kings, resulted in political and religious conflict that ultimately led to the English Civil War. This conflict led to the temporary overthrow of the monarchy, the establishment of the Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell, and the eventual restoration of the monarchy under Charles's son, Charles II. Charles's relationship with Parliament was one of tension and conflict. His refusal to acknowledge Parliament's authority, combined with his extravagant spending, religious policies, and attempts to govern without parliamentary consent, led to a breakdown in the relationship between the monarchy and the English people. The consequences of this breakdown were felt not only during his reign, but also for generations to come, as they led to the questioning of monarchical power and the emergence of new forms of government. Charles Stuart was born on November 19, 1600, the second son of James VI of Scotland and Anne of Denmark. He was not initially expected to become king, as his elder brother, Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, was the heir apparent. However, Henry's untimely death from a fever in 1612 left Charles as the new heir to the English and Scottish thrones. Raised in a court that was deeply influenced by his father, James I, Charles learned to value the divine right of kings and viewed monarchy as an institution ordained by God. In 1625, following the death of his father, Charles ascended to the throne of England. His reign began amid religious and political tensions, both in England and abroad. He inherited a monarchy that had a strained relationship with Parliament, and his father's financial difficulties left Charles with a precarious situation. From the outset of his reign, Charles's belief in absolute monarchy and divine right set the stage for the tensions that would later emerge between the monarchy and Parliament. One of the most defining aspects of Charles I's reign was his belief in the divine right of kings. He believed that the king's authority came directly from God, and that the monarch was answerable only to God, not to Parliament or the people. This belief was a core tenet of the Stuart monarchy, and it set Charles apart from the growing faction of parliamentarians who championed the idea that the monarch's power should be limited by the will of the people and their representatives. Charles's absolutist views were heavily influenced by his father, James I, who had also espoused the divine right of kings. However, Charles's interpretation of this doctrine was more rigid and uncompromising than his father's. Charles saw himself as a ruler whose power was absolute and unchecked. This belief would come into direct conflict with Parliament and the English legal system, which held that the monarch's power was subject to certain limitations. Charles's relationship with Parliament was troubled from the very beginning of his reign. Unlike his father, Charles found it difficult to work with Parliament. His attempts to govern without Parliament led to tensions that would eventually erupt into open conflict. One of the first signs of trouble occurred in 1625, when Charles convened Parliament to raise funds for a war with Spain. The war was unpopular, and Parliament was reluctant to grant Charles the money he requested. When Parliament refused to grant him the funds, Charles dissolved it and decided to rule without Parliament, a decision that would have long-lasting consequences. In the years following, Charles continued to govern without Parliament, relying on royal prerogative and the collection of ship money, a tax traditionally levied on coastal towns to fund naval defense. This was a highly unpopular move, as many saw it as an overreach of royal power and a violation of English liberties. In 1637, when Charles attempted to impose the Book of Common Prayer on the Church of Scotland, it led to widespread protests and eventually to the outbreak of the Bishops' Wars. The conflicts with Scotland further strained Charles's relationship with Parliament, which was reluctant to fund military campaigns without guarantees of political concessions. In 1640, faced with the financial burden of the wars with Scotland, Charles was forced to summon Parliament once again. This Parliament, known as the Long Parliament, was determined to limit the power of the monarchy. The Long Parliament passed a series of acts, including the Triennial Act, which required that Parliament be called at least once every 3 years, and the execution of Archbishop Laud, Charles's chief advisor, who had been associated with the imposition of the Anglican religious reforms that had angered many English Protestants. Religion played a central role in the tensions between Charles I and his subjects. Charles was a devout Anglican, and his religious policies were closely tied to his belief in royal prerogative. One of the key issues was the question of religious reform. Many English Protestants, particularly the Puritans, sought to further reform the Church of England, pushing for a simpler, more Calvinist style of worship. Charles, however, was determined to maintain the authority of the Church of England, and he sought to impose uniformity of worship throughout his realms. Charles's imposition of the Book of Common Prayer in Scotland in 1637 was a major flashpoint. The Scottish Presbyterian Church rejected the book, and a wave of protests known as the First Bishops' War broke out. The conflict forced Charles to call Parliament to raise funds, but this ultimately led to the Long Parliament and the erosion of his royal authority. In England, Charles's religious policies were equally controversial. His marriage to Henrietta Maria, a Catholic princess from France, raised suspicions among Protestants who feared that Charles might be sympathetic to Catholicism. The execution of Archbishop Laud in 1645, after the outbreak of the Civil War, was symbolic of the religious divisions that had characterized Charles's reign. The growing Puritan movement, which increasingly opposed the monarchy, was one of the driving forces behind the opposition to Charles's rule. The tensions between Charles and Parliament reached their breaking point in 1642, when Charles attempted to arrest 5 members of Parliament, an act that was seen as a direct assault on parliamentary privilege. This event led to the formal outbreak of the English Civil War. The war, which lasted from 1642 to 1651, was fought between the Royalists, who supported the king, and the Parliamentarians, led by figures such as Oliver Cromwell, who sought to curb the power of the monarchy. The war was marked by a series of battles, sieges, and shifting alliances. Charles's forces were initially successful, but over time, the Parliamentarians, with their superior discipline and organization, gained the upper hand. The Royalists were defeated at key battles, including the Battle of Naseby in 1645, which effectively ended Charles's chances of retaining the throne. During the war, Charles attempted to seek peace with Parliament, but his offers were rejected. His refusal to compromise on the issue of royal power, coupled with his attempts to undermine Parliament, led to a breakdown in negotiations. In 1646, Charles was forced to surrender to the Parliamentarians, marking the beginning of his downfall. After his surrender, Charles was imprisoned and held captive by Parliament. His fate was now in the hands of the men who had opposed him during the war. The Parliamentarians, led by Oliver Cromwell and other radical factions, sought to put Charles on trial for high treason. Charles, who refused to recognize the authority of the court, was charged with attempting to overthrow the English government and establishing a tyrannical rule. The trial took place in January 1649, and Charles was found guilty. On January 30th, 1649, Charles was executed outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, London. His death marked the end of the monarchy in England, and the country entered a period of republican rule under the leadership of Cromwell. The execution of Charles was a watershed moment in English history. It marked the end of the belief in the absolute power of the monarchy and set the stage for the English Revolution. Charles's death led to the establishment of the Commonwealth and the eventual rise of Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector. Although the monarchy would be restored in 1660 under Charles II, the events of the Civil War and the execution of Charles I had a lasting impact on the English political system. Charles's reign remains a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute monarchy and the importance of the relationship between the monarch and Parliament. His stubbornness, belief in divine right, and refusal to compromise with his political opponents ultimately led to his downfall and the temporary overthrow of the monarchy. His legacy continues to shape the political landscape of modern Britain, where the power of the monarchy is now limited by the principles of constitutional democracy.